The Mississippi class, the last of the American pre-dreadnoughts, at least in terms of when they were designed. Late to the party and built on the cheap, these were ships that were never going to be long for this world, at least in most circumstances. Indeed, they weren't long for the world in American service, nor would they have been in basically any major navy. As we'll see, though, that isn't what happened with these ships. First, though, it is important to note that they were every bit a product of compromise and congressional shenanigans with funding, as their successors, the South Carolinas, would prove to be. In addition to a certain pervasive belief among the Navy Department, principally Dewey of Spanish-American War fame, and Mahan of, decisive battle fame, that many smaller ships were superior to fewer, larger ones. A classic argument, and one that would be repeated later, in more than a few navies. In this case, largely due to the rapidly escalating costs of battleships, and how many of the things the United States was pumping out in the 1890s. This is, of course, an argument that would later rear its head again in the form of Tillman and his protests against battleship construction. The Mississippi sisters, for their part, were always going to be unsatisfactory to actual, serving on the line, not in the back room, naval officers, or even their designers. When funding deliberately sets a lower displacement than a previous design, it almost always results in a ship that is inferior to that previous design, in spite of being newer. Unfortunately for them, the Mississippi class would be no exception. While there were certain other designs contemplated, including an early all-big gun design with no fewer than 12 tonnage guns, the end result of the Mississippi would be haunted by that limited displacement. For the final design would be, fundamentally, a cut-down version of the previous Connecticut design. As previously mentioned, an attempt to save money, cut down on rising displacement in battleships, and also an experiment in how well a small battleship actually worked in practice. All of these are noble ideas in principle, perhaps, but in practice, the result of this decision was a ship that had less than desirable features. Freeboard, for example, suffered greatly. These were very wet ships where the casemate batteries were rather useless in anything but a flat calm. Freeboard was already an issue on the Connecticut, and cutting that lower did the Mississippi sisters absolutely no favors. Another disadvantage would come in speed. Not only did these ships carry a substantially weaker power plant than their larger predecessor, only managing somewhere in the realm of 10,000 ship horsepower, which would have lowered speed to begin with, they also had design choices slowing them down. When cutting the size of the ships, the designers had kept the same main and intermediate battery as that of the larger Connecticut's. This, then, required the ships to hold to the same beam, that is, the width, of the larger battleships. Not inherently an issue, until you realize that they're almost 100 feet shorter than the Connecticut's. The Connecticut-class ships were 456 feet long. The Mississippi sisters were 382 feet long. 74 feet of length on relatively short ships is not a small thing. The length-to-beam ratio of the Mississippi class was all out of proportion, and believe me, they suffered for it. Their seakeeping, in particular, was abysmal. As mentioned, they were slower, proportionally fatter, with less power. The ships would never have kept up with the Connecticut's, or really most of the other pre-dreadnoughts. Not to mention, their cruising speed also suffered because of their design, which made them less efficient at long ranges. Furthermore, the same issues with the beam would also impact their more general seakeeping. These were ships that did not like sailing a steady course. Ships that enjoyed pitching and rolling in the slightest of rough seas. They weren't even particularly stable or good shooting ships in a flat calm. In the Atlantic, which is the only theater of operations the USN could use them in, they certainly lacked in range for the Pacific due to smaller coal storage. They were absolutely terrible gunnery platforms. Their armor was also thinner at 9 inches to the 11 of the Connecticut's, but it covered more of the length of the ship, I guess? The turrets managed to be about an inch thicker too, but not a huge plus in a ship that was full of negatives, as it were. As for the weaponry, as mentioned, it was identical to that of the preceding design, at least in regards to the heavy weapons. The same 4 main battery guns, 12-inch 45 caliber in this case, the same 8 8-inch guns and wing turrets. The difference, and the sacrifice for the smaller displacement and hull size, was in losing some of the smaller guns. Mississippi lost 4 of the 7-inch guns, leaving her with a total of 8, and she lost 8 of the 3-inch anti-torpedo boat battery, leaving 12 of those guns. Plus, as is almost obligatory at this point, 2 underwater torpedo tubes to round it out. So, we've established the background of these ships. A compromise design pushed in an effort to lower cost and displacement, while testing the theory of many cheaper ships over a few bigger and more expensive ships. We've looked at the specific design features, from the speed to their handling to the armor and firepower. What is there to cover past this? Honestly, not much in terms of service history, at least under the Stars and Stripes. Both Mississippi and Idaho commissioned in 1908, well after they were rendered hopelessly obsolete by Dreadnought. They had fairly uneventful service careers, not even getting to be part of the Great White Fleet like other pre-dreadnoughts. As one could, perhaps, expect, they did the usual port visits, training exercises, patrols. Anyone who's been watching my videos knows how this goes by now. I do suppose that Mississippi got to land troops on Cuba one time, and carry pilots to the occupation of Veracruz. Unfortunately, that's about it for excitement in the United States Navy. Idaho got to do even less than her sister. She got to spend some time in Mexico, but didn't do anything particularly exciting in the process. Both sisters would, unsurprisingly, be variously placed in reserve or second-line duties from 1912 on to 1914, at which point they actually get interesting again. You see, unlike Britain, who was building and selling battleships to basically any minor power that could afford it, the United States didn't make a habit of this. There were the Rivadovias for Argentina, but that was about it. And one can certainly say that the United States did not make a habit of selling off fully functional capital ships. Yet, that's exactly what happened to the Mississippi class. You see, this is the time period where the Balkans were even more on fire than they usually were in the 20th century. The Balkan Wars were very fresh in the minds of all the powers in the area. The Greeks, in particular, had cause for concern, as their long coastline and the smattering of Aegean islands basically made it a requirement to have a fleet capable of fighting the Ottoman Empire's navy. The same, of course, went for the Ottomans, which is what prompted them, alongside the utter embarrassment of their fleet by the Avarov, to start doing a crash modernization program. The Ottomans would have gotten the better of the two, absent the Great War, incidentally. What with getting 2 modern dreadnoughts, even if one was admittedly second-hand. The Greeks, meanwhile, ended up with the Mississippi sisters. In the one and only time the United States Navy would sell off functional battleships to another navy, the 2 small pre-dreadnoughts were sold off to an intermediary, who then sold them on to the Greek government. The money from this sale would go on to fund the 3rd New Mexico-class battleship, Idaho, which frankly was worth a lot more than the 2 Mississippis put together. This was in 1914, just 6 years after they had been commissioned. Of course, even at this point, they were very much outdated, with ships like the Queen Elizabeths starting to come around. For the Greeks, though, well, if you can get a pair of battleships, you get a pair of battleships. They had Salamis coming soon anyway, and she was a thoroughly modern, if still small, battleship. The Germans knew how to build battleships, and then the Great War happened. Right. Well, with Salamis out of the picture, the 2 pre-dreadnoughts were what the Greeks could get. Mississippi would become Kilkis, while Idaho would become Limnos, and I am probably butchering both of those. It's funny though, because Limnos is named after a battle in the First Balkan War against the Ottomans. That happened only the previous year, when she was bought as a direct counter to the Ottomans. I see what you're doing there, Greece. Now, the ship still had all the issues I mentioned before. However, in the much calmer waters of the Mediterranean, the stability and gunnery issues were not as big of a deal, Ranges would also, in general, be shorter than in the Atlantic. The Greeks, for their part, were quite happy with the ships, because their most powerful ship prior to this had been the Avarov, which, while admittedly a very nice ship and one that performed miracles, was still an armored cruiser with relatively light guns. Even ships that were as deeply flawed as these battleships were still battleships, and a nice counter to the ex-German pre-dreadnoughts the Ottomans had, though they never actually fought the Ottomans, for better or worse. With World War I a thing, and this is summarizing very complex issues because I don't want to make this an hour-long video, Greece was something of a mess at the time. The king and the prime minister kept sparring over which side for Greece to support. The French, of all people, were growing very tired of this, and basically told the Greeks, disarm those ships or we'll do it for you. Which, well, with the Entente, or Allied powers, whatever you want to call them, occupying Saloniki in Greece, the French seized the Greek fleet. In 1916, the ships had their breech blocks removed along with all the ammunition, including their torpedoes. They were disarmed and stuck in port until the Greeks got their political situation sorted, at which point they joined the Entente against the Central Powers in 1917. You still don't see Kilkis or Lemnos actually fight the Turks here, because the British and French did great power things and kept arguing with each other about giving them back. Who cares what the Greeks think about their ships? Even when the Greeks got them back, there wasn't much need for battleships at that point, so they didn't really see combat, as interesting as the idea of then sparring with Yavuz would have been. Without seeing much in the way of combat in the Great War, the next major event the ships got up to was supporting the White Russians off in Crimea. In this, both Kilkis and Lemnos would perform shore bombardment duties against the Soviets. This was a relatively minor role for them, as the Allies weren't actually getting into full-scale war with the Soviets. Apparently Kilkis's crew got some revenge on the French, though, as French mutineers on their battleships got taunted by the Greeks. With the end of Allied support for the White Russians, though, the next thing the Greek battleships got up to was supporting the Greco-Turkish War. This was, again, not really anything major. The Ottoman Navy had been interned by the Allied powers at the end of World War I. Even if it hadn't been, Yavuz was hardly in any condition to sortie at the moment. Other than supporting landings and escorting transports, the most exciting thing here was, perhaps, that Lemnos was part of the revolution that ousted King Constantine for the last time. This would be the last thing that the younger sister did, however, at least of any note. She'd be decommissioned by the early 1930s, with her armor stripped for fortifications, and her guns used for coastal artillery. Probably well past the point any other navy would have already scrapped her. Even using her as a barracks ship, as the Greeks did at this point, was more than could have been expected in a larger navy. Kilkis, meanwhile, got a refit in the late 20s, but this was far from any sort of rebuild. It was a refit in the truest sense, mostly focused on fixing up worn-out equipment and the like. Even the Greeks considered her outdated by this point, and in fact would have withdrawn her from service in the early 30s like her sister. Unlike her sister, she kept her guns and was called back into service in 35 during a coup attempt. Both of these ships got involved in coups, didn't they? After that excitement, though, she was just used as a training ship. Both sisters would, however, endure until World War II, though by now even Kilkis was basically just a floating gun battery. The two ships would survive the initial stages of Greece's participation in the war, until the Germans came knocking. At which point, they have the dubious distinction of being sunk by Stukas in port. This leaves us with two pre-dreadnoughts, both small and cheap, enduring well past any and all expectations would have had them last, ending only when the Germans bombed them at the dawn of the 1940s, when they were well past any sort of combat utility, and, indeed, were not even combat warships anymore. I doubt that anyone who built these ships could have imagined that being their ultimate fate. The Greeks, for their part, would salvage the ships and break them up for scrap in the 1950s. Remember, if you enjoy the content, please leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.